Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Igor Krupnik at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., 4 hours ahead of people in Alaska, so it's 3 p.m. here, 89 degrees Fahrenheit, so the Washington summer is already here. Welcome to the webinar on Arctic Indigenous Languages. And the title of the webinar is actually From Assessment to Vitality to Active Support. We'll have 3 speakers today, and I'll introduce them in a minute. But first, to let you know that this webinar has been prepared by a section of special team, which is called Community or Community Sustainability Team. And under that team, we have a small subsection, a sub-team that deals with languages, cultures, and identity of the Arctic people. And the main reason we kind of jumped into the idea of this webinar that we have been discussing for probably quite a while, at least for a year, was the recent conference, a symposium, that took place about 3 months ago in Ottawa, Canada, which was called Arctic Indigenous Languages Assessment Symposium, Assessing, Monitoring, and Promoting the Vitality of Arctic Indigenous Languages. And all 3 today's speakers and myself, as well as at least 100 other people, were there at that symposium. And we decided that it is very important that we share the outcomes of the symposium, some of the ideas, some of the plans with a larger audience in the U.S. because the U.S. contingent at the symposium was very relatively small. So here we are. We will go in the following order. The first speaker will be Dr. Lenore Grenoble from the University of Chicago. Lenore is a linguist and specialist in northern languages in Siberia, in Greenland. She worked in Siberia, in Greenland. You probably can see her picture and bio on the screen, at least I can see it. And Lenore has been project coordinator for this Arctic Indigenous Language Vitality Initiative of the Arctic Council. And she will give us some sort of a general orientation about this project, its origination, its goals, aspects, aspirations, etc. Our next speaker will be Kathy Sikorsky, Hisham. Can we get Kathy? Yes, Kathy is on the screen. Kathy is one of the team leaders under the project, and she will give another perspective on that symposium. Kathy works at the Alaska Native Language Center at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And our third speaker will be Bernadette Alvana Stimfel. Her Inupiaq name is Yayuk. Bernadette works in Nome at the Eskimo Heritage Program. She's director of that program. She's also another team leader on the Language Vitality Project. But we asked Yayuk to speak today specifically not that much on the project, but more on the new Alaska Native Language Preservation and Advisory Council that has been established about 2 years ago by the governor of the state of Alaska. And this is a very interesting development. Again, few people know details about how it works. So Bernadette very kindly agreed to talk about it. We hope to wrap it up in about an hour, maybe plus 5 minutes, and then also have enough time for question and discussion. With that, I'm passing the electronic baton to Lenore Grenoble. Lenore, please.
Thank you very much, Igor. Thank you for that introduction, and thanks to all of you who've made this webinar possible. We're all really excited about the opportunity to tell more people about this project. So what I am going to do, as Igor said, is give an overview of the project and sort of the landscape of what's happening with Arctic Indigenous languages. And particularly I'm going to focus on a key aspect of this project, which is that it's an Indigenous-driven initiative. And so I think we want to pay special attention to that fact that this is an initiative that the Indigenous peoples of the Arctic feel very, very strongly about. So I'm speaking, the first slide here has, well, I don't know if you can see it on your screen. I'm also channeling my colleague, Carl Christian Olsen Arpuyu, who is from the Inuit Circumpolar Council in Greenland and has worked very hard in leading the project. And I am speaking in part on behalf of the Inuit Circumpolar Council in Canada, since I have been working for them with this project. But I just want to underscore that it's an Indigenous project. So let's go to the next slide. And I do want to take a moment to thank our funders, as always. This project is sponsored by the Arctic Council and is part of the Sustainable Development Working Group. This audience here today may know a lot about what the Arctic Council is, but we'll talk a little bit more about that to frame things. And we are very grateful to Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada, the Department of Canadian Heritage, the United States National Science Foundation, the Government of Norway, and the Sami Council have funded a lot of the activities and meetings that have been really fundamental in keeping the project alive. Next slide. So just a core point is that the project is founded, again, by the desire of the Arctic Indigenous peoples and through their initiative, but funded on the principle that Indigenous language rights are basic human rights, and that there's a number of international instruments which support that. ILO 169, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the Indigenous World Summit at the UN in September 2014 ratified the notion of Indigenous language rights as basic human rights. Next slide. So just to frame what we are talking about, the audience who tuned into this webinar probably knows about what the Arctic is and where it is. The population of about 4 million people, 500,000 or so of these people are Indigenous peoples, and the Arctic is home to 50 or more different Indigenous peoples, something I think that in the South we sometimes lose sight of. The Arctic, as we define it here for this project, is the 8 nation states of the Arctic Council. Denmark, which includes Greenland and the Faroe Islands, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, Canada, the United States, and the Russian Federation. So if we go to the next slide, you can see a map of the Arctic from the view of the North Pole with these nation states and the linguistic diversity. So the colors refer to different language families representing different groupings, genealogical groupings of languages as spoken in the Arctic. And these are our core participants. The next slide is taken from the Arctic Biodiversity Assessment Report. Chapter 20 is focused on linguistic diversity in the Arctic. And so looking at the different Indigenous languages spoken there, you'll see little dots. The dots are unfortunate because languages aren't spoken in little pinpoints, but across spreads of territory. But the dots are meant to represent something about the vitality of the languages. You'll see a couple of yellow dots representing languages where the vitality is seen as vulnerable, and all the other Indigenous languages are seen as potentially endangered and in danger of being lost. The only one that really feels robustly spoken of the Arctic Indigenous languages is Greenlandic, the Kalaallisut, which is spoken in Greenland. So the situation that is sort of on our doorstep, if you will, is that people are concerned about the loss of their languages to the major Indo-European languages, the languages of the nation states who are in the Arctic. If we go to the next slide, you will see that this slide is just meant to capture the spirit of the project. that the loss of the languages is an issue of great importance to the Indigenous peoples themselves. And so they are working together as members of the Arctic Council in the body of permanent participants to find ways to strengthen their languages. This is a collaborative effort between the Indigenous participants and government leaders and academics like myself to find the best things that we can do and have a sort of multi-pronged approach to the problem. So the next slide, just for those of you who don't know, gives an overview of the Arctic Council. It has these 8 member states who are voting members and the permanent participants. And I've been surprised to find that even, let's see, we're on slide 8. So a lot of times people, even representatives of these different Indigenous groups, don't understand or don't know about their status as permanent participants in the Arctic Council. But being a permanent participant means that these different groups who represent, of course, their constituents, have a seat at the table and are involved in discussions about governance and the future of the Arctic. So we go to the next slide. Tells you a little bit more about the 6 permanent participants. And one of the things about the different groups is that they are transnational. So the Sami Council represents Sami living in Norway, Sweden, Russia, and Finland. ICC, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, represents Inuit in Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Chukotka, which is in Russia. There's Aleut International, Gwich'in International, Arctic Athabascan Council, and the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, representing, these are the groups representing the Indigenous peoples of the Arctic. So in 2008, go to the next slide. In 2008, the permanent participants called together the first meeting ever. They have the right to call meetings, but they had not done so until 2008. And they held a meeting in Tromsø, Norway, on Indigenous languages. I think this is a really striking thing for people who aren't interested in language or who think maybe it doesn't matter, that this was the issue that brought people together and was what they put on the table, that they wanted to find ways to determine how to support Indigenous languages in the Arctic, how to promote them, to share best practices, share knowledge, what was working, what was not. The next slide just shows a picture of the symposium. It's one, I like this picture because it shows the sort of vibrant kind of participation from all around the Arctic of Indigenous peoples, and the URL is there. If you want to learn more about this symposium, you can go to that site. And then the next slide talks a little bit about what happened in Tromsø. This symposium pulled together a large number of recommendations that went to the Arctic Council for endorsement. The project that emerged from it is the one that Igor first introduced in introducing this webinar, the project that we've been calling Assessing, Monitoring, and Promoting Arctic Indigenous Languages. So the next slide talks about the recommendations that came from this meeting. So you can see an idea of where the project has been and where it's going. There was a meeting after the 2008 one in Ottawa in 2012 that brought together a very interdisciplinary set of people to talk about what we could do, what we realistically could do, what we want to do, what our dreams were, and how to get there. And between the meeting in Tromsø in 2008 and the meeting in Ottawa in 2012, the group collectively set some key goals. One was for networking and collaboration, to share our existing research policies and practices, to think about the best ways to have collaborative community-based research, and to establish parameters for interagency and international collaboration. The group also prioritized developing some sort of framework for assessing vitality. People felt very strongly that in order to understand how to move forward to promote Indigenous languages, we needed to have a good sense of their state right now, who's speaking them, where they are being spoken, where we need more materials developed, where things are good, where things need improvement, and attitudes, all kinds of things. We're on still on the previous slide. And then finally, people felt strongly that it would be important to set up ways to communicate and share data. Among the permanent participants, there's a strong belief that there's a lot of shared experience and a lot of shared similarities, I would say, across the Arctic, and so that there's much to be learned from one another by sharing not just resources, but information and approaches for best practices. So the next slide is just focusing on that workshop in Ottawa 2012, mapping out where we really got sort of rolled up our sleeves and mapped out the nitty-gritty of how to proceed. So the next slide after that is three committees. Three committees emerged from that Ottawa 2012 workshop: an assessment, a committee on language acquisition, which Hisham and Yayu both chair, and a committee focusing on language policy. And critically, and I think this is really important for this project, let's actually skip the next slide about collaborations. There's lots of collaborations going on at all these levels, but what I want to talk about is the principles and parameters that are driving the project since, I would say, since Tromsø or even before. But the idea that the development, the implementation, and all of the reporting of the assessment must be Indigenous-driven. These principles are very important for external researchers like myself to get an understanding of what people want and how to make our own research effective. So point number two, that any kind of assessment needs to be relevant to speakers and community members, as well as the policy developers and people doing language programming. There's also a need for a framework that can account for vitality at the high ends of the spectrum, say in Nunavut or Greenland, where we have fairly robust language usage, and in other areas where we have really seriously endangered languages. Critically, any kind of assessment needs to be based on Indigenous or community-defined factors, and also assessments need to take into account the dynamic nature of languages and how they are changing. I should step back and say that some of the need for assessment is that our understanding of language vitality comes primarily from census data that's conducted by the Arctic governments, and the data don't allow for any sort of dynamic shifting nature in languages. We have new speakers learning languages as revitalization programs kick into gear, and census data are often driven by needs other than what Indigenous communities want. So the questions that are asked are quite different. So this is sort of an idea that for Indigenous people to work on their languages, they need to know the state of the languages within the terms that they care about. The next slide continues with these principles and parameters, and as I said, the assessment needs to talk about revitalization, and even if there are revitalization efforts going on, people want to know if they're effective or not, or how they could be better, or what best practices can be shared. So also, any assessment should take into account the impact and influences of languages, why languages are being lost to other languages or why they're not, so to get at the factors involved in language shift. And then critically, the idea that the assessments need to be accessible and well-defined so that the populations, the target populations who are being assessed can understand what they're being asked about, and also that the results will be relevant for them. One of the most innovative things about this assessment metric that is coming forward is the idea that community members will provide their own input and peer review the findings. So many people in the Arctic have complained about the fact that they will read some report about their community or about themselves and find that it doesn't match up to their own experiences. So they want to have an opportunity to say, yes, this is right, or no, it's not. So in looking at this project, going on to the next slide, there are a lot of challenges in doing this in a pan-Arctic way. We have a huge amount of territory. There's a lot of just vast geography, as I say here on this slide, significant cultural differences, a continuity in a project. As I say, this project probably has its birth date in 2008, but of course, there was a lot of planning that went on before 2008 to make that symposium happen. And here it is 2015, so we're 7 years down the road. Who's carrying the project forward, and how do we keep things going forward without reinventing the wheel each time? The project is hugely collaborative. I glossed over some of that in the interest of time, but collaborations are time-consuming and very difficult to manage. People's expectations differ and levels of commitment differ. And sometimes, sometimes governments are not as supportive. That not everyone plays nice is actually aimed at governments who aren't always supportive of language initiatives. So the next slide just gives you a sense of how we are geographically spread. So Igor pointed out how warm it is in Washington, D.C., and we've got 2 participants today coming in from Alaska. You can see we span in the Arctic many, many time zones. So looking forward, onto the next slide, as Igor said, in 2015, in February of this year, we had a symposium that brought together the findings from the 3 committees which I outlined, and in addition held a youth symposium which was run by Anguti Johnson and Shelley Tulloch, which gave Arctic youth an opportunity to spend some time together, brainstorming and talking about how they want to move the project forward, and then come and join the symposium itself and be full participants there, since there's a very strong feeling in the Arctic that the future of the languages really rests in the hands of the youth, that they are going to be the ones to carry things forward. They are the speakers, the future speakers, and they are the parents of future speakers in terms of their children. So a set of recommendations emerged from this symposium, and I've gone through this background to give you a good sense of where these are coming from and how we got to prioritizing this set of recommendations. So if you go to the next slide, you will see that for the immediate future and going forward, we'll be prioritizing 6 areas. One is networking and collaboration. We still need to develop an effective system for networking, sharing best practices in terms of research and policy, and establishing parameters for better communication and international collaboration. We did establish a vitality assessment questionnaire based on the desires and principles of the group, and so we now need to move forward and start pilot testing that and see how it works on the ground. There was initially a very strong desire to have a single questionnaire, a single assessment metric for all of the Arctic, and then people realized that we would need to have some local questions for particular circumstances in individual areas, and so those have been put forward in a question bank. So people want a pan-Arctic assessment so that we can look at the Arctic as a whole and consider it an area, but then because it is divided up into different geopolitical regions, then we will need area-specific questions. A third recommendation and priority is what we are calling networking for resource discovery. We know that there are a lot of language resources out there that we have yet to, that local people may know about, but other people don't know about. Even people speaking one language, there may be language materials in another village or another community that they don't know about. Sometimes these are recordings of elders speaking. Sometimes they're materials that individuals have developed. We just don't even know exactly what's out there. We do know there's quite a lot of really priceless, invaluable audio recordings, and we would like to identify them. We want to get a system so that they can be preserved for a long time, archived properly, since a lot of the older recordings are on tape that deteriorate, so we'd like to digitize them, archive them properly, and get a system going so that communities can have better access to important resources for their own language. Next slide. The policy committee, I think Hisham is going to talk a little bit about this, but in a nutshell, the policy committee felt strongly that after assessing language policies throughout the Arctic, that the permanent participants themselves need to create their own policies to help promote language vitality and to undertake measures at a local level and at the level of the permanent participants, which, as I said, are more international, transnational organizations to promote vitality of their languages. So part of this is taking ownership and responsibility and moving forward, the people moving forward themselves. The Committee on Language Acquisition, I'm sure Hisham is going to talk about this, identified a really urgent need to find better methods for teacher training and to create venues for longer training sessions. We find that the Indigenous language teachers often just have workshops over a weekend or a week or two, summer camps, and teacher training is a longer process, an ongoing process, and we need to get our Indigenous teachers better training. They need better materials, and we need better pedagogical materials to teach the languages in the classroom. In many cases, the assessment to date has shown that a lot of our teachers need to improve their own knowledge of the Indigenous languages. They aren't always learning them as first languages in the home anymore, and so we need to help them get their language abilities up to speed so that they can teach them well. And finally, a major goal is thinking about community language needs. Each community has different needs and has different challenges. So we want to, we have proposed a structure that will help identify those needs and find possible remedies. So this bullet point is trying to strike a balance between the language, the fact that the language needs at a local level are very personal and very localized, and we can share best practices, but we still need to really think about what's happening on the home front and how to get communities themselves actively involved and excited about having a very ongoing, strong commitment to language learning. So the last slide is just a picture from the project website. Going forward, we are currently working in different avenues to think about how to carry the project forward under the U.S. chair of the Arctic Council. As I said in the beginning, this is an Arctic Council project of the Sustainable Development Working Group, so we are looking forward to having a lot of exciting work coming out of Alaska during the U.S. chair. ICC Canada is continuing to play a leadership role, and I think that we should see some really exciting things going forward. I will stop talking here and pass the baton on to Hisham.
Thank you, Lenore. This was a very, very informative summary of the project and of the symposium. Hisham, besides talking about the group that you co-chair with IARPC, which is on language acquisition, perhaps you may say a few words just of your personal feeling or experience from the workshop, so that people have this idea of the energy, the strength, the enthusiasm, so that we could share it a little bit.
Is it Kathy that's next, or IARPC?
Kathy.
Kathy, okay. And Kathy, you should be unmuted, so.
Okay.
Presentation.
Thank you, Igor and Lenore. Some of what I'll say will probably overlap with what Lenore said, but hers was a little bit more detailed. So we could go on to the first slide.
Sorry, just a second.
Okay.
Go. Okay.
Okay, just wanted to say hello and thank you for this invitation to speak on my first webinar. My name is Hisham, and I'm Gwich'in Athabaskan and Koyukon from Fort Yukon in Alaska, and I learned my language, Gwich'in, as an adult and learned it as a second language. So it is possible to learn an Indigenous language, and I hear it a lot of times that it's impossible, but I know it's possible. I'm currently working on an interdisciplinary PhD in linguistics and anthropology, which I hope to finish this summer. My topic on my PhD is ancestral language learning and effects on identity. So can I have the next slide? And like Lenora said, I want to provide a small summary of the ICC meeting in Tromsø, Norway in 2008. At that time, I had no idea that I would be part of this group, but the recommendations are on this slide. And it's pretty clear that Indigenous language learning and teaching were paramount in their discussions, and that they wanted to include culture and youth as a large part of their recommendations. So the next slide. So as a result of the Tromsø recommendations, there was a meeting in Ottawa, Canada in 2012. And through this gathering, the 3 committees were formed that are all intertwined. These language committees, as shown on this slide, are on 1, policies and planning, 2, status of the languages, and 3, language acquisition, and which Yayuk and I are co-chairs. So this presentation will focus on language acquisition rather than the policies and the status of Arctic indigenous languages that Lenore talked about. The next slide. And at the recent 2014 meeting in Ottawa, each of these committees presented. And I think a lot of eyes were opened, especially the Aleut, who didn't have a representative. However, 2 of them attended, and 1 was selected as a representative. As far as language policies went, only 2 areas were represented, Greenland and Alaska, who spoke about their language policy. So it would have been nice to see more representation on these policies and what is really being done, rather than to just talk about them and to see the concrete outcome. Okay, so next slide. So one of the things we did at the Ottawa meeting